Major Fred Tracy could not see his instruments. The panel in front of him was dark. His gun sight was gone. The oxygen line to his mask had been cut, and the cockpit stank of cordite and scorched wiring. 9 cannon shells from a MiG had walked across his aircraft, and one of them had torn through the nose and detonated somewhere behind the controls. He was over North Vietnam, near Hanoi, in the most heavily defended airspace on the planet, in an airplane that had never been designed to do what he was about to do. The date was June 29, 1966, and the machine he was flying, the Republic F-105 Thunderchief, was not a fighter at all. It was a bomber, a big, heavy, supersonic bomber built to carry a nuclear weapon into Soviet Russia at treetop height. Nobody at the factory had ever expected it to turn and fight another aircraft. Yet in the next few seconds, with no sight and no working instruments, Fred Tracy was going to kill a MiG. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something small. This channel is a small Cold War and military history channel, and lately our views have slipped. If you enjoy careful, well-researched history like this, please consider subscribing, leaving a comment, and sharing the video. Every single interaction helps the channel reach new people and lets me keep making these deep dives. Now, back to the sky over Hanoi. For most of the air war over North Vietnam, the Thunderchief was the hunted, not the hunter. It was the airplane the MiGs were sent up to kill. It flew about 3/4 of all the American strike missions over the North during the long bombing campaign called Rolling Thunder, and it took heavier losses over that country than any other American aircraft in the war. The men who flew it called it the Thud. The story you have probably been told is that it was a loser, a lumbering target, a design that failed. But that story leaves out something strange. By the end of the war, this bomber that was never meant to dogfight had been credited with 27.5 kills against enemy fighters, every one of them a MiG. To understand how a nuclear bomber ended up shooting down almost 30 MiGs, we have to go back before Fred Tracy, before Hanoi, back to a drawing board in New York in the early 1950s, and to a decision about what kind of airplane America thought it would need for the next war. Because the whole tragedy and the whole strange triumph of the Thunderchief begins with one fact: it was built for the wrong war. In 1951, the engineers at Republic Aviation on Long Island began sketching a new machine. The lead designer was a Georgian immigrant named Alexander Kartveli, a brilliant man who had already given the United States the P-47 Thunderbolt and the F-84. His team looked at more than 100 different shapes before they settled on one. The requirement handed to them by the Air Force was very specific, and it had nothing to do with air combat. They wanted a fighter bomber that could carry a single atomic bomb, fly deep into enemy territory alone, and do it fast and low, under the enemy radar. Everything about the airplane was bent toward that one purpose: speed, range, and the ability to haul a heavy load. Turning and dogfighting were simply not on the list. What came out the far end of that process was enormous. When it first flew in 1955, the Thunderchief was the largest single-seat, single-engine combat aircraft ever built. It weighed around 50,000 pounds fully loaded. A single Pratt & Whitney engine pushed it past twice the speed of sound at altitude. It had an internal bomb bay in its belly, nearly 16 feet long, made to hold a nuclear weapon. When it went to war in Southeast Asia, that bay usually carried a fuel tank instead, and the bombs hung underneath the wings and fuselage, up to 14,000 pounds of them, more than a 4-engine bomber had carried in the Second World War. For defending itself, it had one built-in weapon, a 20mm rotary cannon in the left side of the nose, a Gatling gun that could spit out 6,000 rounds a minute. It carried just over 1,000 rounds. That gun would matter more than anyone expected. The nickname needs a word. Some said thud was the sound the airplane made when it hit the ground, and in the early years it crashed often enough that the joke stuck. Others traced it to a character from a children's television show. Whatever the origin, the men who flew it turned the word from an insult into a term of deep affection. They loved the machine, even as it frightened them. Here is the heart of the problem. By the time America went to war in Vietnam, the Thunderchief was a superb tool for a job nobody ended up asking it to do. There was no nuclear strike into Russia. Instead, there was a grinding, conventional bombing campaign against a small country with one of the densest air defense networks ever assembled. The Thud was sent to fly straight into that, day after day, loaded with iron bombs, down predictable routes, at predictable times. And waiting for it were the MiGs. The men who flew those MiGs belonged to the Vietnam People's Air Force, a young service that had almost no tradition of its own and yet learned very fast. They flew two Soviet-built fighters. The first was the MiG-17, a small subsonic machine armed with cannon and nothing else. It had no radar and no missiles, but below about 5,000 feet, it could outturn almost anything the Americans owned. In a close, twisting knife fight, it was deadly. The second was the MiG-21, a supersonic delta-winged interceptor that carried heat-seeking missiles. It was built for a single slashing pass. It would come in fast from behind, fire, and be gone before the Americans could react. Two fighter regiments carried most of this fight: the 921st, the first and most famous, and the 923rd, formed in the autumn of 1965. Their pilots did not try to win a fair fight. They did not need to. They flew inside a tight system of ground control, with radar operators on the ground watching the American formations and talking the MiGs into exactly the right position. The MiGs would wait on the ground, protected, until the strike aircraft were committed and heavy with bombs. Then they would rise, strike at the most vulnerable flight, and dive away. Their airfields, for a long time, could not even be attacked, and when things went badly, they could flee north, toward the Chinese border, into airspace the Americans were forbidden to enter. For the Thunderchief pilots, this was a nightmare with a very particular shape. Their airplane was fast in a straight line, faster than a MiG-17 and able to match a MiG-21 in a dash. But loaded with bombs, low, and boxed into a bombing run, it could not turn with either of them. To fight, a Thud pilot usually had to throw away the very bombs he had flown 800 miles to deliver. The moment he jettisoned that load to save his life, the enemy had already won, because the mission was dead. So the MiGs did not always have to shoot the Thunderchiefs down. Sometimes it was enough just to make them appear, and appear they did. In December of 1966, MiG-21s of the 921st Regiment tore into the Thunderchief formations and, by their account, knocked down more than a dozen of them across a series of interceptions without losing a single MiG in return. It was a humiliation, and it was a warning. The men in charge of the American air war understood that something had to change, or the Thud force would be bled white before it ever reached its targets. The confidence on the other side was real, and it was earned. The North Vietnamese produced pilots who became legends in their own country. One young man of the 921st, Nguyen Van Kock, would end the war as the highest-scoring ace on either side, credited with shooting down 7 aircraft, several of them Thunderchiefs, all flown in the MiG-21. In the 923rd, a farmer's son named Nguyen Van Bay became one of the great MiG-17 aces, credited with 7 victories, scored in that little cannon-armed machine that should, on paper, have been hopelessly outdated. These were not lucky amateurs. They were skilled, aggressive, patient hunters, flying at home, over their own soil, with the ground guiding their every move. They believed, with good reason, that the big American bomber could not touch them. That single belief is the thread that runs through everything that follows, and it is the belief this story slowly takes apart. But to take it apart, the Americans first had to solve a puzzle, and their first attempts to answer the MiG did not involve the Thunderchief's gun at all. They involved trickery. On January 2, 1967, a legendary fighter leader named Robin Olds ran an operation called Bolo. He took F-4 Phantom fighters and made them behave exactly like Thunderchiefs. They flew the same routes, at the same heights, at the same times, and even broadcast the same radio patterns, so that on the enemy's radar screens, they looked like a fat, predictable strike of bomb-laden thuds. The MiG-21s rose to the bait, expecting easy prey, and climbed straight into a trap of waiting fighters. In a matter of minutes, the Americans shot down several of them for no loss. It was a brilliant deception. But notice what it really says. The best short-term answer to the MiG problem was to disguise other airplanes as Thunderchiefs, because the Thunderchief itself was seen as a victim, not a predator. The airplane's own crews were about to prove that judgment wrong. They proved it in the worst possible way, which is to say defensively, when cornered, with everything already going wrong. Which brings us back to Fred Tracy, blind in his cockpit over Hanoi, on June 29, 1966. Tracy was part of a strike against fuel storage near the enemy capital. His flight was jumped by MiG-17s. In the swirl of the fight, cannon fire ripped into his Thunderchief and knocked out almost everything he relied on. His instruments died. His gun sight went dark. His oxygen was gone. And then a MiG-17 made the mistake of overshooting, sliding out in front of him, filling his windscreen. Tracy had no sight to aim with, so he used the only reference he had left. He lined up the long pitot boom on the very nose of his aircraft, pointed it at the enemy like a finger, and squeezed the trigger. The 20mm cannon roared. He watched his shells sparkle down the side of the MiG, into the wing root, and the enemy's wing folded up and over. The MiG went down. Fred Tracy, half blind and badly hit, had just scored the first confirmed MiG kill for the Thunderchief. He nursed his broken airplane home. The bomber had bitten back. That kill set a pattern that held for the rest of the war. The Thud almost always killed with its gun, not with missiles, and it almost always killed the nimble little MiG-17, the one it supposedly could never beat in a turn. The trick, the Thunderchief pilots learned, was not to try to turn with the MiG. It was to use their tremendous speed and power to control the fight, to force an overshoot, to catch the enemy for the half-second it took to bring that Gatling gun to bear, and then to blow through and away before another MiG could settle behind them. The airplane, built for a straight-line dash into Russia, turned out to have exactly the tools, raw speed and a heavy cannon that a bomber needed to survive a knife fight it never wanted. Then came the spring and summer of 1967, the season when the Thunderchief truly turned on its hunters. The targets in that period were some of the hardest of the war, and the fighting over them was savage. On March 10, 1967, the Thuds went after the steelworks at Tai Nguyen, north of Hanoi. It was a brutal day, and it produced two of the most remarkable feats in the airplane's history. The first belonged to Captain Max Brestol of the 354th Tactical Fighter Squadron. In the middle of the strike, Brestol got behind a pair of MiG-17s. He closed to within a few hundred feet of the fourth enemy aircraft, in a line, and fired a long burst, watching his rounds tear into its wing and fuselage until fire bloomed at the wing root. Then he shifted to the next MiG and hit that one too. In a single pass, Max Brestol had shot down two enemy aircraft, the first American pilot in the entire war to do so on one mission, both with the gun. The same terrible day produced a Medal of Honor, and it went not to a man who shot down a MiG, but to a man who ignored the MiGs entirely to do something even more dangerous. Major Merlin Dethlefsen flew what was called a Wild Weasel mission. His job was the most feared in the theater. He flew a two-seat Thunderchief deliberately toward the enemy surface to air missile sites, baiting them, daring them to switch on their radars and shoot, so that he could find them and destroy them and clear the way for the bombers behind him. On that day, his leader was shot down almost at once. Dethlefsen's own aircraft was badly damaged, and MiG-21s tried to finish him. Rather than run, he dove into the storm of anti-aircraft fire, using the flak as cover from the fighters, and made pass after pass against the missile sites until he had destroyed them. He brought his shredded Thunderchief home. He had never stopped to save himself. The Wild Weasel mission deserves to be understood, because it is where the Thunderchief crews showed the coldest kind of courage. Their unofficial motto was first in, last out. They arrived over the target before the strike force, to draw the missiles onto themselves, and they left after everyone else, staying behind to protect the withdrawal. The two-seat Thunderchiefs that flew these missions carried a pilot in front and an electronic warfare officer behind, a man who read the enemy's radar signals and told the pilot which way death was pointing. Both of the Medals of Honor earned in the Thunderchief went to men flying this mission, and the second one contained, at its heart, A MiG kill. On April 19, 1967, Major Leo Thorsness flew a wild weasel mission with his electronic warfare officer, Captain Harold Johnson, in the back seat. They knocked out missile sites as they were meant to. Then Thorsness's wingman was shot down, and the two crewmen floated toward the earth under parachutes. What Thorsness did next is almost hard to believe. He stayed. He circled the descending parachutes to protect them, and when a MiG-17 came in to strafe the helpless men, Thorsness turned on it and shot it down with his cannon. Low on fuel and nearly out of ammunition, he then saw a rescue force arriving and threatened by still more MiGs. So he turned back into 4 more MiG-17s, alone, to draw them away, damaging one and scattering the rest. He landed with his tanks all but empty. His back-seater, Harold Johnson, was credited with the MiG in the official reckoning of that day, from the rear cockpit. When it was over, Johnson said only, "That was a full day's work." There is a bitter turn in Leo Thorsness's story. Just 11 days after the mission that earned him the Medal of Honor, on April 30, 1967, he and Harold Johnson were shot down by a missile from a MiG-21, flown by one of the pilots of that skilled 921st Regiment. Both men ejected. Thorsness was badly injured by the force of it. They were captured, and Leo Thorsness became a prisoner of war in the North for nearly 6 years. His Medal of Honor had to be kept secret the entire time he was a captive, for fear that his jailers would single him out if they knew. He was released in the spring of 1973. Later, he served in the Washington State Senate. He died in 2017, at the age of 85. The great days kept coming through that spring and summer. On May 13, 1967, the Thunderchiefs had their single best day against the MiGs, downing 5 of them, with Phantoms adding more. In June, a pilot named Ralph Kuster fought a MiG-17 down low, in exactly the kind of turning fight the Thud was supposed to lose. The MiG hauled into a tight descending turn and forced Kuster to overshoot, but he rolled his big fighter, dragged his aim ahead of the enemy, and fired at point-blank range. The MiG exploded so close in front of him that burning debris splattered across his windscreen and was sucked into his engine as he flashed past just feet beneath the wreckage. It is Custer's gun camera film that produced one of the most famous images of the air war, a MiG-17 being torn apart by 20mm fire. The last air-to-air victories for the Thunderchief came on December 19, 1967, when its crews downed 2 more MiG-17s, one of them shared with a Phantom. That shared victory is the reason the final tally is not a round number. It is 27.5. 24.5 of those kills were scored with the gun. Only 3 came from missiles. And here is the fact that says everything about this airplane and its enemy. Every one of those 27.5 victims was a MiG-17. The Thunderchief never once shot down the faster MiG-21. The supersonic interceptor, the hit-and-run killer, remained beyond its reach for the entire war. Against that machine, the Thud did not score. It only died. That is the part of the story the kill tally hides, and honesty demands that we look straight at it. The reversal in the air, the 27.5 MiGs, was real, but it was won at a staggering price, and most of that price had nothing to do with MiGs at all. Of the 833 Thunderchiefs ever built, very close to half were lost in Southeast Asia. The most careful accounting puts it at around 395 aircraft gone, of which 334 were lost to enemy action and the rest to accidents. And the thing that killed most of them was not the MiG, and not even the missile. It was old-fashioned anti-aircraft artillery, the massed guns that threw up walls of steel over every target in the north. Of the combat losses, the great majority, something like 280 airplanes, fell to those guns. Around 24 fell to surface-to-air missiles. And the MiGs, for all the fear they caused, accounted for a smaller share, somewhere between 17 and about 22 Thunderchiefs, depending on whose records you reconcile, the American counts or the Vietnamese ones. Of those, it was again the supersonic MiG-21, not the little 17 that did most of the killing. The human cost behind those numbers is hard to sit with. There was a stretch of the war, across the worst years of the bombing, when it was calculated that a Thunderchief pilot had only about a 3 in 4 chance of surviving a full tour of 100 missions over the North. Think about what that means. Flip it around. 1 in 4 would not come home whole. More than 150 Thunderchief crewmen were killed or went missing, and when you add in the men who were captured, the toll of those killed, missing, or made prisoner climbs past 200. The men who flew the Thud knew these odds. They flew anyway. And this is the final, quiet irony of the whole story. The Thunderchief was eventually pulled out of the war, not because it had failed, but because there were simply not enough of them left to be useful. Production had ended years before. Every one shot down was gone for good, and could not be replaced. It became, by one historian's account, the only American combat aircraft ever withdrawn from a war simply because too few of them remained. The airplane built for the wrong war was consumed by it. So what was the Thunderchief, in the end? Not the failure of the old story, and not the invincible MiG killer of the title either. It was something more human than both. It was the wrong airplane, flown into the wrong war by men who refused to lose, and who wrung out of a nuclear bomber almost 30 air-to-air victories that its designers never dreamed of. They did it mostly with a gun, mostly on the defensive, mostly while trying to survive long enough to drop their bombs and go home. The lessons of that air war did not die with the Thunderchief. The Americans had gone into Vietnam believing that speed and missiles had made the old skills of the dogfight obsolete, that pilots no longer needed to learn to turn and fight up close. The MiGs, and the men who flew them, proved that belief dangerously wrong. Out of that hard schooling came a revolution. The Navy built its Top Gun school to teach real air combat again. The Air Force built its own great training program in the Nevada desert, called Red Flag, where crews could practice against enemies who fought the way the enemy really fought. And the aircraft that followed were designed to a new philosophy. No more single-purpose machines like the Thunderchief, built for one narrow mission. The fighters that came next, the ones that would rule the skies a generation later, were true all-rounders, able to fight and to bomb with equal skill. When American air power returned to war in the desert of Iraq decades later, it dominated the sky in a way the Thunderchief cruise over Hanoi could only have dreamed of. That dominance was bought, in part, with the lessons of their loss. The Thunderchiefs themselves grew old gracefully. The survivors were handed down to the reserve squadrons and the Air National Guard through the 1970s. The very last flight of an F-105 in American service came on February 25, 1984, almost 30 years after the type first left the ground. Today, you can walk up to one in the great aviation museums, at the National Museum of the Air Force in Ohio, at the Smithsonian, and at air bases and parks across the country. There is a statue at the Air Force Academy of Carl Richter, the youngest pilot ever to down a MiG in the Thunderchief, a 23-year-old who volunteered for a second 100 missions and was killed on his 198th, forcing his crippled Thud away from a village before he ejected. He did not survive the rescue. It is worth remembering what these men themselves said, because they spoke about the airplane with a plainness that no narrator can improve. One of them wrote that for all the sneering, a startling fact had gradually become clear over Hanoi. The Thud was getting through to the target as nothing else could, and the name that had first been spoken as a joke had become one of the most respected in the whole fraternity of flyers. Another simply called it the greatest airplane he had ever flown. And Carl Richter, the boy who died on his 198th mission, once said something about the enemy pilot he had shot down that stays with you. He said the man was a flyer just like him, flying for the other side, doing a job he had to do. The certainty that sent the MiGs up over Hanoi was the certainty that the big American bomber could not touch them. For a season, that certainty looked like the truth. The Thunderchief was slow to turn, heavy with bombs, hunted from above and hammered from below. But the men who flew it took that certainty apart, one MiG at a time, with a Gatling gun and raw speed and a refusal to jettison their nerve along with their bombs. They were flying the wrong airplane, built for a war that never came, into the war that did. And that, in the end, is why the Thunderchief is remembered not as the plane that failed over Hanoi, but as the bomber that learned to fight back.